Welcome. The title of this lecture is The Reformation, Part 2. I'm just continuing on from Part 1 of the Reformation, and I want to begin this lecture taking a look at how Catholics responded to the Reformation. And this has been considered called either the Catholic Reformation or the Counter Reformation. But actually, even before Martin Luther had posted his 95 Thesis on the Wittenberg Castle door in the year 1517, even years before, there were a number of Catholics who were looking to reform the church. And one example was Queen Isabella of Spain. And Isabella wanted a process where the best candidates were chosen for high ecclesiastical posts, high church posts. She received support from Francisco Jimenez. Jimenez was a Franciscan monk who earlier went to prison for 10 years rather than participating in some corruption. Both Isabella and Jimenez, who actually became the archbishop, the two of them, they visited convents, they visited monasteries, and what they were doing was calling for a renewed obedience to monastic vows, the vows of a monastery. So they wanted to see, greater sincerity and piety among those who were part of convents and monasteries. The two also promoted scholarship and the printing of books, including a multilingual edition of the Bible written by the best scholars available, at least available at that time. When it was finally completed and published, the year was 1520, Jimenez declared, quote, this edition of the Bible that at this critical time opens the sacred sources of our religion from which will flow a much purer theology than any derived from less direct sources. End of quote. Now, unfortunately, this example of affirming the superiority of scriptures over tradition was not common with Catholic leaders. Later, Jimenez himself became the Grand Inquisitor who had no tolerance for any doctrinal deviation. As it turns out, the Catholic Church was slow to respond to the development of Protestant theology. In the case of Martin Luther, there was a delay of official condemnation because the Holy Roman Empire was experiencing a change of leadership. Thus, there was no real commendation from the church because some of the things that were happening politically. Uh, to explain this, Charles I could not jeopardize the political support of German princes. He was the emperor and he needed the support of German princes. In Rome, the Pope was Pope Leo X. Leo was a patron of the arts, and he was distracted by artistic beauty and worldly pleasures. And so he was a little slow off the mark, and his condemnation of Luther was late. The next pope after Leo was Adrian VI. He was critical of past church and priest activity, and he actually attempted to reform the church. And he wrote, quote, we know that in this holy see, referring to the Vatican, now for some years there have been many abominations, abuses in spiritual things, excesses in things commanded. In short, that all has become perverted. End of quote. Rather remarkable statement from the Pope. Because Adrian's reign only lasted for just over a year, no reform took place. Adrian had actually died shortly after becoming pope. Next pope was Clement VII. He was a cousin of Leo, and he was more concerned, it seemed, with Italian politics. So there was really not much movement as far as in addressing sort of any of the grievances of the various protesters who became known as Protestants. There was, however, a number of things that were done in response to Protestantism that was in some ways effective. And one of them was the Council of Trent. There were some Catholic leaders earlier who had called for a council to discuss Luther's ideas. In fact, even in the early stage, Luther himself had desired to see a council to sort out various grievances. But the popes had feared the power of a council. In the past, councils had claimed supremacy over the popes. So they were a little wary over they were concerned. They wanted to protect their powers and concerned that the councils would undermine some of their power. So nothing really took place. Rome only agreed to calling a council when the divide between Protestants and Catholics showed no sign of reconciliation. So with the rupture of Christianity becoming permanent, Catholic leaders met at Trent. This is a city located in northern Italy. They met in the year 1545. The Council of Trent discussed reform of the church until 1563, so almost 2 decades. However, it is important to point out that there were extended periods when actually the council was in recess. So it wasn't as though they were meeting all those years. Even though Catholics and Protestants were, and I guess you could say still are, in agreement on most theological matters, and of course, where we would have agreement with Protestants and Catholics would be on the Trinity, on God creating all things, on God the Son becoming man in the incarnation of Jesus, born of Mary, crucified and raised from the dead. God the Holy Spirit had inspired the scriptures, and they would agree on original sin. Jesus' death on the cross made possible a new reconciliation between humanity and God. All of these things were agreed upon by Catholics and Protestants, but no, there was not going to be any reconciliation between them. It did not occur. Catholics and Protestants were unwilling to compromise on their interpretation. So the Council of Trent, actually went beyond condemning Protestantism. It sought to discuss the Catholic theology that the protesters, that is, the Protestants, had questioned. As a result of the Council of Trent, there were many decrees, including, and I have a list of 8. First, bishops were to reside in their own diocese. And this is, again, addressing the issue earlier where bishops, some of them had never set foot in their own diocese. Also, the sale of indulgences was forbidden. No selling indulgences. 3, clerics were to give up their concubines, and that's would obviously be a fairly no-brainer. This is something that would have to be done. Four, bishops were ordered to visit every house within the diocese at least once every 2 years. And again, trying to have, a more personal and direct relationship with the church flock. Point five, every diocese was to establish a seminary. And here, the importance of getting education, believing that if there was better education of priests, there would be better education preaching of the people who, and then in essence, to provide proper teaching, at least proper Catholic teaching in contrast to what was seen as Protestant heresy. There was, and point six, this is relating to this, more attention to the preaching of the uneducated, so more emphasis on preaching. They another decree was promoting the study of Saint Aquinas, Thomas Thomas Aquinas, and finally, there was the declaration that the Vulgate, the Latin Bible, would be authoritative. Now, according to church historian Justo Gonzalez, the Council of Trent marked the birth of the modern Catholic Church. Now, another response by the Catholics were some new religious orders. And one I want to talk about is the Society of Jesus. New religious orders such as the Society of Jesus were founded. In 1540, Pope Paul III approved the new monastic order founded by Ignatius Loyola. Born in 1491, Loyola was a Spanish nobleman who had experienced a serious wound to his leg. This ended his career as a professional soldier. And while recovering from his wound, he experienced a desire to serve Christ. According to historian Robert Linder, Loyola became, quote, a mixture of soldier, mystic, and monk. He was an excellent model for the talented young men who became Jesuits. The Jesuits thought to win converts through a strategy of teaching and preaching. Jesuits believed that church reform could be achieved through education, and they concentrated on preaching to pagan peoples and challenging what they viewed as Protestant heresy. Again, this is something that was taken up by the Council of Trent. A highly centralized organization which stressed obedience to the Pope, the Society of Jesus played a major role in strengthening Catholicism in Europe, and particularly Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. But it also was far ranging, the Jesuits. Quality rather than quantity was Loyola's strategy, but the growth of the Jesuits was stunning. There were Jesuits in Japan, Brazil, Ethiopia, the coast of Central Africa, and almost every country of Europe by the time of Loyola's death in 1556. So remarkably, less than 2 decades, you have the Jesuits in so many different places, and uh, and this would be the case for subsequent decades and centuries, and we see the Jesuits uh, popping up in all parts of the globe, and they played another example was the role that they played with the evangelism and missions that were taking place in Quebec. this was a French colony in Canada that began in the year 1608, and the Jesuits came in shortly after, a couple decades after, and played a key role in the Catholic life there in Quebec. Now I want to look at another response to Protestantism within Catholic circles, and that was the Inquisition. The Inquisition, also known as the Supreme Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office, was composed of a committee of 6 cardinals, and these cardinals had judicial power to arrest, imprison, and execute those who were allied with Protestant heresy. And the Inquisition was a major instrument of the Catholic Reformation in the Roman Catholic countries such as Italy, Spain, and France. In these countries, the Inquisition was very popular with the people as it was a major deterrent to Protestantism and a growth of Protestantism. So this component then was just sort of an overview of the Catholic response to the Protestantism. Now I want to the Reformation. Now I want to look at the social impact of the Reformation. So looking at some examples of how the Reformation it had influence on society. The growth of Lutheranism or Protestantism had broad social implications. Religious revolution initiated social revolution. And okay, so remember that we're talking about between 80 and 90% of the people, the masses, the common masses, the peasants who are or sorry, 80 to 90% of the population is composed of peasants. And many of these peasants really do not have much freedom. They don't have much status. And many peasants who heard Luther's Luther's words, and they I mean, there's no way we can measure to get any precise numbers, but clearly there would have been those who would have admired Luther's defiance of authority, the authority of the church. His words, referring to Luther's words, quote, "A Christian man is the most free lord of all subject to none," end of quote. This is something that Luther wrote in the year 1520 in his work called this treatise called On Christian Liberty. And one would expect that these would have been pretty exciting words for the peasants. And as it turns out, there were massive revolts that occurred in the years after Luther had stated these words. In fact, in 1524, there were massive revolts throughout regions of Germany. In fact, as many as 300,000 peasants had rebelled against the government. So what did the peasants want? Well, their demands included the abolition of serfdom. They wanted to see no more oppressive taxes and tithes. They wanted to see church reform, and they were open to the idea of confiscation of church property. Again, the church had owned quite a bit of property. And they also wanted the use of the forest, that is the Lord's forest. And this was the case where you would have the aristocrats, the king would be controlling lands, and they would not, and the peasants would not be allowed to hunt in these lands. And this is something that they wanted. Violent protests, however, went too far, and not even Luther was sympathetic to their cause. In fact, in 1525, Luther wrote a tract entitled Against the Murderous Thieving Hordes of the Peasants. Well, the title says it all. And this is what Luther wrote. Quote, I will not oppose a ruler who, even though he does not tolerate the gospel, will smite and punish these peasants without offering to submit the case to judgment. For he is within his rights, since the peasants are not contending any longer for the gospel, but have become faithless, perjured, disobedient, rebellious murderers, robbers, and blasphemers, whom even heathen rulers have the right and, and power to punish. Nay, it is their duty to punish them. Well, he goes on, but this is quite a remarkable statement. But to explain this, I mean, Luther certainly was radical in the sense that he challenged the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, but he was no political radical. Luther was one who respected law and order. Now, I want to turn to a group of Protestants who had been known for their radicalism. Among Protestants known for their radicalism were those belonging to the Anabaptist movement. The Anabaptists first appeared in Switzerland, and that was mainly due to the freedom that the Swiss offered. Neither feudalism nor the papacy had gained acceptance in Switzerland. Now, beyond Switzerland, Anabaptism took root in southern Germany, Austria, and the Netherlands. Emerging in the year 1525 as certainly a group of Protestants with distinct opinions on church life, the Anabaptists were regarded as the radicals of the Reformation. Anabaptists claimed that only adults could make a free choice about religious faith and baptism, and denying the validity of infant baptism. Thus, they required converts to undergo a second baptism, and this is where we have the meaning of the term Anabaptism. Children who had been baptized as infants needed to be rebaptized to become true Christians. Luther and Lutheranism had accepted the traditional argument for infant baptisms. So the Anabaptists were quite distinct, quite unique for taking this position, whereas generally the majority of Protestants would have followed more what Luther had presented, and that is, infant baptism. Now, when we enter into the modern era, it's a case where there are many denominations who uh, do not approve of infant baptism, and the the doctrine and the policy is for to have baptism similar to what the Anabaptists were presenting. The Anabaptists viewed the Bible as the sole law of the church, and this is how one historian explains it. The Anabaptist ideal implied a self-governing congregation independent of state or episcopal control, having the Bible as its law and living a rather ascetic life of strict conformity to a literal interpretation of supposedly biblical requirements. Another historian puts it this way: the Anabaptists believed that the pure church was to be a free association of regenerated, of the regenerated, rather than a state church which had some unsaved in it. So the association would be true believers, whereas it, contrast would be a state church which would have some unconverted or unsaved. A civil government was necessary, and this, of course, I mean, the Anabaptists understood that there had to be a civil government, but the Christians should not have any share in it. That was their position. They recognized that there must be secular government, but they did not want to see any Christian be a part of it. Anabaptists oppose any secular or church leader who sought to limit the perfect freedom of individual conscience. The entire membership, following the authority of Scripture, decided matters of doctrine. And so what we see here is, you know, clearly a distinct approach, and also, their notion of separation of politics. In fact, the Anabaptists were skeptical of political institutions. This is this I want to read a following. The following is actually a description by an early 16th century government official, and he's referring to the Anabaptists. And this is what he says: although the Anabaptists are not the only ones who use the external watermark of rebaptism, they are nonetheless distinguishable by certain characteristics and features, namely that none of them carry a sword or sue for outstanding debt. They also say that no Christian, if he truly is one, should give or receive interest on capital, that all goods are free and should belong to the general community, and that every person has property rights in them. They teach that no Christian should rule over another and are unabashed in doing so, having the audacity to base their claim on the scriptures. And although government cannot be maintained without the bond and obligation of oath swearing, all of them teach that a Christian should not swear an oath to the authorities or to anyone else. All of these things to the disgrace and oppression of Christian orderly government, brotherly love, and general peace. End of quote. Well, this government official obviously is clear where he stands. No surprise, he does not see this as good a good idea. He did not agree with what the position of the Anabaptists. He did not believe that you could possibly have orderly government, brotherly love, if you have such such freedoms. Certainly, as a radical movement, the Anabaptists did indeed attract extremists. Johann Dent was an example. He preached that a Christian might live without sin, and there's also a number of different events that point to the extreme element that could be a part of the Anabaptist movement, and one notable example was the Anabaptist takeover of the German city of Munster. And this took place in the year 1534, where a group of Anabaptists, numbering apparently as many as 10,000, had seized the marketplace and town hall of Munster, and they also expelled the Lutherans and Catholics who lived in the city. So basically, just conquered this city, Munster. They were led by John of Leyden, who had a harem of 15 wives, and with this interesting individual leading them. They established a royal court, and all opponents were put down. And uh, if that meant violence, so be it. So they were bloodily put down. This is clearly not peace loving. The Anabaptists adopted a form of socialism where all goods were held in common and they opened all houses to all. Also, polygamy in this incident was established. And again, if we have their leader having 15 wives, it's no surprise that polygamy was allowed. With the exception of the Bible, all books were burned. As it turn as it turns out, it took an army organized by the bishop of the city of Munster to storm and reclaim the city. After defeating the Anabaptists and executing John of Leyden, the army allowed the city to return to Catholicism. The descendants of Anabaptism include the Moravian Brethren, Mennonites, the Amish, and Hutterites. The Anabaptist movement in the Netherlands was led by the peace loving Menno Simons, and Simons assumed leadership of the Brethren, the name of that the Anabaptists of the Netherlands adopted in order to get rid of the stigma that had been attached with the name Anabaptist. Thus, in the Netherlands, the Anabaptists became the Brethren. The Anabaptist name was toxic in many parts of Europe. The last component of this part two lecture of the Reformation is looking at the political impact of the Reformation. So I want to just briefly talk about three regions. First France, then England, then Italy. France. One result of the Protestant growth in France, the French Protestants were known as the Huguenots. One result of the Huguenot growth in Catholic France was one of the most brutal wars in European history. The Protestant challenge to the political power of the Catholic elite was unsuccessful. Beginning in the year 1562 and lasting approximately 30 years, this civil war was won by the Catholics. And one of the sort of infamous days was St. Bartholomew's Day, and that was when there was a massacre of Protestants. Thus, in France, we see that one result of the Reformation was this France in you know this experience in France of just a horrible civil war where the Protestants were pushed out, and this would have actually influence effects elsewhere. For example, I had mentioned the Jesuits being in the Quebec colony of France. The Quebec colony would not allow any Protestants in that colony, and we don't see any Protestants um, established there in Quebec. That doesn't take place until after the fall of New France. Um, so yeah, I should a correction there, referring to the colony of New France. I should have stated. Okay, the in England, just across the English Channel, the Reformation gained acceptance, but rather uniquely. It gained acceptance because of Henry VIII. Failing to obtain permission to divorce, Henry took advantage of widespread anti clericalism to sever the authority of the Pope and place himself as the supreme head of the church. So we have this new church, the Church of England. Thus, the Reformation in England was initiated by the ruling elite rather than by religious reformers. Final, Finally, Italy. Just a little mention of them. In Italy, the Catholic Church, by way of the Inquisition, was able to stamp out any significant growth of Protestantism. And there in Italy, the political elite remained Catholic. Now, there's much more that could be said about the political impact of the Reformation, but I'm just going to just keep it with those three examples. And just to conclude this lecture, and again, the Reformation is an essential um, um, episode in European history, in the history of Western civilization, and I could have actually said more about some of the things that were happening. For example, Calvinism. I only mentioned Calvinism in the first part, but did not give it too much treatment. But yeah, very a fascinating period in history where we see remarkable transformation take place. But I'll just leave it with the big idea. The one thing that certainly stands out was that the Reformation shattered the unity of Europe as an organic Christian faith. Thank you.